going behind the scenes with some very special people on profiling Australia's vulnerability, a project that we all worked on nearly 10 years ago now, and introducing the characters to you that are in each of the episodes. And one of them is a very special person sitting to my right, Dr. Mark Crosweller, newly minted Dr. Mark Crosweller. And sort of in my eyes, Mark is, you know, the philosopher, the leader and the captain of the team. But I'd really like it for you, Mark, to introduce yourself to the viewers.
Sure, thanks Jill. So Mark Crosweller, I've had 40 years in emergency management at the National Security and Crisis. I was a Commissioner for Emergency Services, a Director General of Emergency Management Australia, Head of the National Resilience Taskforce, and that's when I met Jill. We've worked together for well over 20 years, both strategists in our industry, both highly regarded and respected for big thinking. We drove some people off the wall on the process. But it's been a real pleasure travelling this road with Jill, and it's been a long association and a very fruitful and beneficial one. And I think this conversation and this venture, this project, is about exploring our experiences and what we went through. It's a way of passing on knowledge and experience to other people. So it's a pleasure to join you today, Jill.
Thank you, Mark. I'm really excited about this conversation, and it really is for me a trip down memory lane, and I'm sure over the years I've forgotten so many things that are important to remember. So having these conversations, I think, and people having conversations generally and remembering things is so important to be able to pass on that knowledge and exchange the experiences and the lessons that we've learned. And in thinking, even just preparing for today, I was trying to remember when we did first meet, and I think it was definitely 20 years ago. And back then I was with AFAC, the Australasian Foreign Emergency Services Authority, the National Council for all the Emergency Services in Australia and New Zealand. And you were on the knowledge management group. I think that's where we started, with knowledge management, Mark.
We did indeed.
And look where we are now. So I just think being on that journey with you as well, I have learnt so much, which is why, you know, you're a teacher, you're a philosopher, you've taught me so many things over the years. And I know that you are highly regarded across the country and across the world, and have been teaching people a lot for a very long time. So thank you for joining me today.
You're welcome.
And as I've mentioned, we're going to go behind the scenes on one of the biggest projects that I've ever been involved with, and the backstory to it from my perspective, when I think about it and I start to explain it to my grandchildren, is pretty complex and diverse and very challenging. And along the way, both of us took a lot of risks. We took a lot of risks, and there were many times when we drew on our courage and resilience to be able to keep going. I myself could have taken the path of least resistance many times, but I didn't, because the team that we had created to do this was such a great unit, and we helped each other through some turbulent times. But Mark, I'm really interested in sharing my story about what I was experiencing before I came to Canberra to do this project. But I'd really love it if you could remember or try and give a sense of what your environment was like as Director General of Emergency Management Australia. And you and I had just come off the back of doing a very significant workshop on national capability, and there were some profound things that came out of that. So when you went back to Canberra and I went back to AFAC, there were some movements behind the scenes. Can you share what that was from your perspective, and why you chose to sort of tap me on the shoulder as a secondee for EMA?
Yeah, certainly. You were tapped on the shoulder because of your exceptional ability and talents, Jill. And I say that
Thank you.
With great integrity, because you are a strategic thinker. You do think outside the box, and you're prepared to ask the questions that nobody else is prepared to ask. So that's what attracted me to bringing you across under secondment, because I needed big thinkers and original thinkers on complex problems. I think I worked out as Director General, and I published on this over a number of years now, that we could very easily hit our limits of capability. And once we hit the limit of capability, we were really entering a space of what I now call mutual vulnerability. where not only are citizens vulnerable, but so are governments, so are agencies and institutions. We were asked to look at a national risk assessment. The government has in fact, in 2025, just completed that risk assessment at a very high level.
Okay.
But I'm told they won't be releasing it because it's too sensitive, which is unfortunate. Maybe they will release it, but I remember we had a similar roadblock 10 years ago about how do you capture risk, how do you depict it, and how do you publish it? And it was a hurdle that was very difficult to get past. But I think we also realised that it would be quite abstract, and I think what we were concerned about is place-based and value-based propositions in risk, and how do you get to the real propositional value of community, where you've got to look at vulnerability. For the audience listening today, I've got a slight speech impediment, so please forgive me.
Not feeling 100% today, so I'm very grateful.
So I think it really came about because we did the work on the National Capability Statement. We realised that what we were doing is expressing a point of limit. And I was very big on this about the system was not limitless, and I thought it was. It had a psychology, it had a culture and attitude that it could do anything, had a defiance and an overconfidence. I talked about this in my TED talk recently, that it just thought it was
put a link up to that too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I've listened to it, was fantastic.
It was like the sector had this bravado, this strongman attitude that it could deal with anything. But if you looked at reality and the inquiry processes and how citizens felt about the outcomes of these big disasters, they were anything but happy, and we had performed anything but well. So there was a point of limit. We had to discover what that was, and I think that's what led us to say, well, really, we have to look at you can say the word.
Take your time. Vulnerability.
That word.
Yeah.
Because it was the key to risk.
Can I just stop you there for a second?
Yeah, sure.
You just triggered a memory. See, this is why these conversations are so valuable. I remember, because I was in AFAC at the time as the Director of Strategy and Capability, and that particular piece of work you're talking about and reaching the limitations had been something that we in the AFAC world, and you as a council member, would have seen and contributed to some of that discussion about the role of the emergency services was changing, and the need to, the institutionalisation of the emergency services to date had served well, but there's a profound shift going on. So I recall numerous times listening to some of the leaders in this space really trying to grapple with this and work out what their role is, and the expectations that, to me, my words are kept piled onto them as people became, as the disasters kept happening and the natural hazards kept getting more intense and damaging. So everyone looks to the emergency services for a response or for some way of solving the problem. And this was where I think when I came to the conversation about coming to Canberra, this is what I wanted to get to have a look at, was this is not just the emergency management sector's problem. This is a whole of society problem. We all create the risk in one way, shape or form, but the emergency services deal with it, the residual risk, when things go bad. So I think that when I came to Canberra, I was expecting that we would work on the capability stuff to that next level to really start to challenge the roles and responsibilities around it. So that sort of shifting then and being asked to do a national risk statement. You said some words to me, I'm not sure if you remember them, when I got to Canberra and we sat down like this, having a chat about all the things that were going on. And I said something along the lines of, I'm here, Mark, what would you like me to do? Do you remember what you said to me? Yeah,
I said, think big, think profoundly, and there's no boundaries, there's no limitation.
Do you know that has stuck with me forever? You have no boundaries to your thinking, Jill, and I want you to ask the profound question.
Yeah.
And so that, I just was shocked that you had placed so much trust and faith in me. But also absolutely privileged to be able to have a leader, an executive, a Director General of EMA say those words to me and mean it.
Absolutely.
So you never stood in my way the entire project. We used to have regular meetings and, you know, touch points, and I'd come to you if there was ever any issues, and quite a few times I know we had barriers and blockers, so I would say to you, what do you think, Mark? Do I keep going, or do you want to take some interventions?
Yeah.
And I don't recall a time when you stopped me.
Oh, no, never did, because I was serious about what I said. Being boundless in terms of our thinking. I mean, there's always the question of politics at the end, about when we land on a proposition, is it politically palatable? Can a Prime Minister sell it? Can a Minister sell it? Can the Cabinet agree with it? But that's a long way down the path, and I think governments actually do expect public servants and people more broadly giving them advice to think laterally, to think contingently, to think big. You can always pare back if you need to, but if you start small, you end up small. And we decided not to do that. And I think I would say to anybody who's entering the world of public policy, which is part of this conversation is about, helping people to understand our journey, is to not be afraid to think big. And certainly when we migrated to the task force, which we'll get to shortly, I guess, it was even easier to think bigger because we had the time to think. And I think that was one of the great privileges of working with individuals, that we found ourselves in a set of circumstances where we did have time to think deeply. And because people, to be straight up about it, didn't understand what we were doing, because nobody wanted to talk about vulnerability. And so they kind of left us alone, which was a good thing, until we published the work, and then they got very interested because it was groundbreaking. It was so groundbreaking, it was picked up by the United Nations. So I think setting the scene and making that boundless commitment to think laterally and differently and pragmatically and profoundly is really important, and giving people permission to do that. It means mistakes will be made along the way, and it does push buttons, it does upset people because they either can't get their head around the issue or don't want to get their head around the issue because they're very attached to their knowledge.
It took us a while to get our heads around it too.
Oh, enormously, because nobody ever talked about it.
No one had ever done it before. It's the spiral of silence.
That's right.
That really was killing us, and being able to get to the root cause of why there was so much harm and loss occurring, which I know is one of your areas of your research and your teaching, and that it was not, don't keep blaming the natural hazard. Natural hazards are not the disaster themselves, it's when they intersect with us, when they affect our lives, when they damage our systems, when they overwhelm our capability and our capacity to cope. That's when disasters occur on a grand scale.
Yeah, it sort of came from my proposition that the greatest measure of success was the upholding of public trust and confidence. And the greatest mission was the reduction of suffering of humans and non-humans. And if we lost sight of either of those two things, we were losing sight of being of service to others. And it's where politically we ran the risk of being severely criticised. It didn't matter where you sat in the system. If you moved off this notion of trust, if you moved off the notion of compassion or reduction of suffering, then we were starting to miss the point. I think that's what that was our North Star.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
what we kept coming back to.
Absolutely. Did you have much pushback that I didn't know about? Were you sort of kept
yes and no.
to yourself?
I think the task force particularly was very difficult, not difficult to set up initially, but became very difficult bureaucratically.
Right.
Because the work we were asked to do had never been done before. And people couldn't see the problem. They thought the problem was a natural disaster, was nothing much you can do about it. You've got to get more helicopters, more flood boats, more fire trucks, more money. And we kept saying that's not the root cause of the problem. It's not the root response to the problem, at least. And it took us a long while to help people understand that disasters weren't in fact natural. That where and how we place ourselves upon the landscape was a big part of whether something was hazardous or disastrous.
Do you remember, or you would remember, I have vivid recollections of the significantly and major workshops that we held around the country. So I think the first cab off the rank was Queensland, then we went to South Australia. Actually, Tassie and South Australia combined. Then we went to WA, and by this stage we had amazing insights and data and lived experience stories and scenarios that we ran. But the moments of aha, when people started to see the penny drop, when we're talking about systemic vulnerability, and some of the reactions that people had, particularly the scenarios that we played out, which are happening now. And yet some people were incredibly traumatised by even the thought of the scenario happening, including those in the emergency management sector. Like how would they cope? Do you remember those?
I do indeed. I think it really spoke to the heart of
being personally vulnerable.
Yeah.
And leaning into that.
Leaning into it, because people don't like to. Vulnerability is about the susceptibility to harm and suffer, and the inability to cope with it. And it's the inability to cope, I think, is where people really struggled. I think most people can accept that harm is part of life, an unfortunate part of life in many aspects, and some of it is unnecessary, of course. With proper risk mitigation and other things, we can get a lot of the harm out of the system, which is really what we do when we look at vulnerability. So I think it did shock people, but it inspired people as well, because it was new ground and it was safe space. We created a safe space. It felt
magical, didn't it?
It did.
It was magical.
We created the safe space for people to think differently and to think laterally and to think from here, not just from here.
Fully embrace it.
To fully embrace it and to connect with what other people might experience or go through. I think that got to the heart of the issue. And it's unusual for public servants to be able to do that. And a lot of my lecturing since then, in the last 10 years, has been trying to encourage public servants to see, sense and feel their own suffering and vulnerability and that of others. It's okay, because that's what makes us human, it's what makes us relational. So it did open up a conversation in government and in policymakers, which people never felt they had permission to do so, or had the safety to do so.
National leadership. So I remember coming to you and expressing some frustration, which I could do from time to time. Because I was getting a little tired of hearing from all quarters that it's not the Commonwealth's role to exercise national leadership on this subject matter. And we had a really deep and meaningful conversation about this, because in the Constitution, the Commonwealth does not have a role when it comes to emergency management. That's the states and territories. And the Commonwealth has a responsibility for its deployment of its own resources. That's a really important point that people forget. And at the time, the call for national leadership from the Commonwealth, other than an ATM, so the money machine,
the cash machine,
it became a real conversation that we took to states and territories. And this was one of the components. I was going to say shocking, could be shocking, unsettling. If people didn't believe us, that we were truly co-designing this.
Absolutely.
And that we were truly using the convening power of the Commonwealth in a way to bring the parties together to solve a very complex problem. And I know you led the charge with that, with the conversations with the states and territories.
So we introduced the notion of national interest. Rather than Commonwealth interest or state interest. What we were doing was in the national interest. And nobody owned that, but everybody owned it. The Commonwealth had a role. The Commonwealth had a role, particularly in terms of facilitation and bringing people together and negotiating and finding agreement. That's something the Commonwealth does well and should do. And in the process of doing that, we never took anything off the states. We didn't take their resources, we didn't take their power, and we didn't take their money. We left everything in place and said, this is not about any of that. You can redistribute those equities any way you like. This is about thinking and knowledge. It's about a common problem, because the hazard space doesn't understand boundaries.
Exactly.
It simply doesn't get it. It's not interested. And as I often say in my lectures, that Mother Nature is very kind, because she'll tell us what she's about to do, but she won't ask. She doesn't seek permission. We have to tune in and understand these forces of nature go across boundaries, culture, time, space, gender, religions. They cut across everything, and that's where our thinking went. That we have to take a more unitary approach, a more holistic approach to a problem that demands such, because that's the nature of the hazard we're dealing with. So to break it down into the jurisdictions and responsibilities too early would have been to miss the point entirely. And that speaks to this notion of anthropocentrism, where we think we're in charge. As humans, we think we've got something over nature, or we need to contest nature. And what we were saying is, no, you have to live with nature. We have to take these forces into account and accept our vulnerability and learn how to deal with them.
Just sticking with the states and territories and that sort of dynamic of ANZEMC at the time, the Australian New Zealand Emergency Management Committee, which was essentially a decision-making body that and a pathway into cabinet, if I've got that correct. If possible,
to the national ministers.
to the national minister, to the Australian government,
Yep.
and yeah, there's another body through. I forget what that's called too. So ANZEMC was the
ANZEMC Ministerial Council.
Ministerial Council. That's right. Thank you.
That's okay.
And then into the National Cabinet, so
Yep.
the Australian Government Cabinet because we ended up getting the AVP there, didn't we?
We did.
Which was a measure of success of the project for me, and I want to talk about this as well. Because within the first 12, we did that work in 12 months. That was pretty amazing. And then the task force happened, and then the next 2 years,
Yeah.
we worked on a bunch of other amazing things as well, which other members of the team led, and I sort of helped participate in that process. So the measure of success for me was that at least the work we do is at such a level and so profound that we start to change the national narrative.
Yeah.
So that we start to talk about other factors at play. So the vulnerability issue, the third aspect of the risk triangle, the least understood, and systemic risk even less understood than that. So at the end of 12 months, and with that work, the narrative had shifted significantly. So for me, I was really happy with that. But to get the next piece through right up to cabinet, that went way beyond my wildest expectations of success of that work. I attribute that to the coalition of the willing that we had pulled together, which was over 250 people, and the magic that was created in being able to turn the conversation into, and this is what I mean about the magic in these environments, that it tapped into a latent feeling that people had about this fog and the uncertainty that they were feeling about, we've got this problem, how do we deal with it, what can we do with it, you know, what is it, how can we get to the heart of this? And this work did that in some part for them. And so the change to the national narrative, and I know you were speaking at lots of places and helping contribute to that national narrative, and would you like to reflect on that?
Well, it made people more human, because we're talking to the human aspect of risk, and I think people could see themselves in the picture and it access how they felt about it, not just what they thought. I think that's what
they could see themselves in the picture. Exactly, because we put them there.
We put them there.
We put them right there, yeah.
And I think they realised that the truth of the issue about risk is that we were looking at the heart of risk. And we've looked at hazard for a long time, and we
know it very
hit
well.
limitation. We've looked at exposure for a long time, and hit limitation. When we looked at this subject, we were pretty much unlimited in our ability to analyse it, speak about it, and do something about it. So I think it was a very human experience, and I think we gave permission for people to be human and to feel their way through the issues.
Yeah.
But we were trustworthy. We didn't judge. We didn't criticise. We didn't mock or deride what other people might have thought was bad thinking or silly ideas. We accepted on face value that all ideas were valid, but not all ideas could prevail.
Yeah.
But people had a chance to speak and speak safely. So.
Yeah.
So it really was groundbreaking. I think we can't talk too much about the cabinet space because it's in confidence, of course.
No, but it did. That it got there was terrific. Yeah.
And the work's been published, and it was published unedited. So I think that's probably the greatest measure of success. That the work that we did was circulated for comment amongst many people, and it came back with no changes.
Yeah.
So in my way of thinking, I think we had done the work on the consultation.
We took about 9 iterations, I think, of us getting it to that level before it went through that final phase.
And it still stands the test of time. It's still used today. It was talked about this week in NEMA.
Really?
There was a presentation on it in NEMA this week to the staff.
Okay.
So it's still 10 years later, it's still having an effect, and I think it's a document that really will last into perpetuity because it gets to the heart of the issue, and vulnerability will never disappear.
Yeah. So another aspect of multiple challenges. So I'm just hitting the highlights. I'm just wondering about.
We're good for time.
All good for time. Obviously, with systemic vulnerability and systems thinking was a brand new concept to a lot of people. I know now, I didn't perhaps know it at the time, but I know now that I have been a systems thinker my entire career. Just wasn't called that. So I could see and feel and strategize about what's going on and all the elements that come together to change, to problem solve and transform and change. One of the things here with going through the systemic issue and systemic disaster risk, we went there, and that is to decision makers. So the decision to put people in harm's way in the first place, the decisions that transfer the risk from one set of people or institutions to another, and the information that is not necessarily shared along the way, and really trying to lift up people's eyes to what was going on in terms of the decisions that are being made in the first place, and on what basis are those decisions being made, and are they addressing the systemic vulnerabilities or just dealing with the hazard. I think there's been a shift over the last 10 years around the decision makers and their acceptance now that there are other measures that need to be taken into account when they're
yes and no.
making decisions?
I think there's individuals who have demonstrated that capacity, but I think systemically there's a long way to go. I think when you talk to Russell to explore the values, knowledge,
It's Russell
rules,
Wise from CSIRO, by the way.
Yeah, he introduced the notion of values, knowledge and rules in decision making. I think that was a fascinating insight
That
which
was groundbreaking.
really helped us to understand the nature of decision making and risk. I think the notion of value was fundamental. I think people thought of value only in economic terms, essentially.
Yeah.
When we looked at non-commensurable values and those values you can't possibly measure financially or numerically, was not groundbreaking in academia, but it was groundbreaking in bureaucracy.
In our world,
In our world.
Yeah.
And I think that exploration of decision making in the context of knowledge, values and rules was also fundamentally new to the sector. But look, to answer your question, has it changed the decision-making processes since? It has had an effect. There is more conversations about this process of decision-making, but in terms of, we're still releasing land in dangerous places, we're still trading off, we still have values tensions, which the AVP talks about.
Yeah.
Those things are still going on, and it does depend on the political agenda of the day. So if it's about low-cost housing, because we've got a housing supply issue, then risk goes out the window. And I've seen that over and over again in the last 10 years. Unless there's a consistent conversation and a prioritised conversation about disaster risk, you'll get sidelined pretty quickly for other
The stakes are getting higher and higher now, aren't they?
Well, they are. And I think the housing crisis is because we just simply have not planned for it.
Yeah.
We don't have a national housing strategy. We don't have a national settlement strategy. We've got immigration, then settlement is up to the states and territories, and the two things don't link. So you can see that there's the cause and effect of inadequate policy. But what gets sacrificed is disaster risk in the process, because everybody needs a house. And land is cheap to build and cheap to buy and cheap to build. But land that's cheap to buy and cheap to build is usually highly hazardous. So it is still problematic, but there's many more conversations and much more awareness of the problem, which puts pressure on the system to do the right thing. But there's that values tension about prosperous now and prosperous future, which is playing out in terms of developing land and building homes, which is a real tough piece of competition.
Do you need to take a break?
Yeah, let's take a break.
Okay.